It's episode 218 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please subscribe to the show. It helps other folks find it by boosting us in the rankings. This is the first episode of our special DragonCon 2017 coverage. I'm going to be bringing you lots of extra episodes this week and probably some into next week as well. I've got so much stuff to bring to you. I think you're going to be really excited to hear what all happened. Today is an interview that I did with Richard Garriott and Starr Long. Saturday morning, I met up with them in Starr's hotel room, and we had a fascinating conversation. It was kind of a geek's dream come true to sit down with these two guys. Richard is the creator of Ultima, one of the longest running RPG series, computer games ever, and Starr then was the mastermind behind bringing that to ultimately be Ultima Online. And now these guys are doing a joint venture called Shroud of the Avatar, and they teamed up with Tracy Hickman from Dragonlance and have made something stunning. So we talk about that and all kinds of stuff. But before we get into this interview, I would like to thank our executive producers who generously donated to help cover the DragonCon 2017 expenses that we had. Jason Onspach and Nick Cole's Galaxy's Edge, Will Swardstrom, Chris Porteau, Doug Bradley, Stefan Boltz, Eamon Ambrose, Rhett Bruno, Crystal Watanabe, Thomas Hickok, Philip Harris, Alexander Moore, Christopher Vallon, Kat Feeler, Patricia Gilliam, Samuel Peralta, Bob Williams, Ed Gosney, Rob Roy McCandless, James Slater, Rory Donahue, Deborah Capps Kennedy, Greg Martell, Alicia Myers, Michael Nelson, Chris Fox, Richard Fox, and John Frater. Thank you all so much for your generosity and for helping executive produce the special DragonCon 2017 coverage. Now on to our interview with Richard Garriott and Starr Long. Stay tuned tomorrow for more episodes. Welcome to the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Richard Garriott and Starr Long on the show. You probably know them through... Richard has written many books, has been an explorer, an adventurer, and was the founder of Ultima. And Starr Long was the founder of Ultima Online. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a storyteller or a writer?
For me, it would have been a specific moment when reading The Hobbit. And in my case, it came about the same time as I was exposed to some of the early computers, in my case, teletypes.
Right.
And I was beginning to play Dungeons and Dragons. And when I was reading The Hobbit, I'm sure everybody remembers the map in the first few pages,
right?
Which I glanced at and then went on to read the book. And then suddenly, second or third chapter in, they give you the translation of some of the words on the map.
Right.
And then I flipped back to the map and realized those were really the words that were really written on that map in runic. And that kind of reality crafting suddenly showed me that this writer, Tolkien, had created a reality that was much deeper than I had previously thought could be done.
Right.
And that, at least for me, was sort of this inspirational moment of like this aha of, wow, a masterful writer goes so many levels deep,
right,
before they ever manifest the story on top of it. And so I kind of admired that and wanted to emulate that starting right then.
Wow. And I think for me, I think it was two separate events, separated actually by several years. One, I think it was the first time I was at, my mom was a librarian, and so I spent a lot of time in libraries, either at the state library where she worked or at our local public library. And I remember the first time I walked past a room and I saw people sitting around playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I was like, what is going on? And I walked into the room, and then they were very. I was pretty young. I think I don't know. I may have been 7 or 8 because it came out in '77. Yeah, and so I was 7, right? So it was right when it came out, and I was like, what are you guys doing? And they explained it all to me, and I was like, oh my god, this was really cool. And I was like, what is he doing? And they were like, he's the dungeon master. And I'm like, that's what I want to do. I want to be the dungeon master. And my friends were very excited about the fact that I wanted to be the dungeon master because that's the most work. Like no one wants to that's all the work.
Right.
Like you have to collect all the prepare. You have to prepare it ahead of time. And so they were like, oh great, we don't have to do that. And so and I loved that part because that you had to tell this because a good dungeon master is the guy who tells the stories.
Right.
Like it's not just about like rolling dice and because those guys, the guys who just do that aren't very good, frankly. But
right.
the ones who like tell stories and sort of weave all of those like little separate moments in a campaign together, those are the guys. And I don't know if I was any good, but I had fun doing it. And so I think that was a moment. But then the sort of second moment for me was when I got into high school, and I was in a magnet high school that was both a college prep, so math and science and English, but there also was a strong performing arts program there, and I started doing theater, and it kind of oddly enough dovetailed into my experience doing role-playing games, right. Because it was getting up on stage and telling stories, and that's when I decided, well, this is what I really want to do. I want to get into theater, and so it was really those two moments for me.
Dungeons and Dragons and high school theater have been the 1-2 punch that have brought many a good person down.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Richard, you talked about Dungeons and Dragons also in your book Explore Create, and I know that you had a similar experience. Talk about how that, the love of fantasy and being able to act that out, so to speak, and the cooperative storytelling nature of Dungeons and Dragons. Like Starr said, that the Dungeon Master is responsible for creating the world and the atmosphere and the story, but it is a cooperative storytelling.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I got started, as well, we used to host big D&D events at my parents' home on Friday and Saturday night, all night.
Right.
And one of the things I was struck by is how we had a big enough group that we often had 5 or 6 games going independently. And while I enjoyed also being the dungeon master and being the person who helps weave the tales together,
right.
I also learned from many of the others who, in many cases, were more masterful or daring than I was. I remember a gentleman who's still a friend of mine, a guy named Bob White, and he tended to role play more Cthulhu, darker games, and I would, when I would take a break from my own game mastering and I'd walk by the room where he was dungeon mastering, it would actually be truly creepy, when I would listen in to the kind of things, the tales he was weaving, and I would kind of sit in awe and go, how is he doing this? It literally was creepy enough. It made me, in some dark recess of my mind, even wonder, are they really perpetrating evil or something, in here? Is there something different going on in his game that, mine seems so light and, and
those after school specials are real.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and yes, this thinking of the game master as the weaver,
right,
who is taking the disparate pieces of not only their own, preparation, but then the real-time interactions with the other players around the table, is what I think really makes, separates the good game masters from the bad.
Sure.
And as Starr mentioned about the dice rollers versus the storytellers, we too. So we got started in those earliest days when people might have seen the original 3 books, but even those, not only were they thin on rules in the first place, but nobody paid attention to them. Right? You kind of glanced at them and threw them away. And this is before you could easily buy many of these other ones. Like there were competitors to D&D that right. we often had Xerox copies of, just because no one ever saw the original. And but again, those you would glance at, be inspired by, and then set them aside. But when I went off to high school and college, or when I left high school actually and went off to college, I came back to the old D&D group to see how it evolved. And the earliest people that were attracted to D&D, I think, were largely good interactive storytellers.
Right.
As it became popular, you ran out of good interactive storytellers. And that tended to then, the advanced D&D rules tended to draw out these dice rollers to where I would come back and I'd hear people sit down and debate, well, I've got initiative and I'm behind you and I'm up 2 feet, so I get a +1 and a -2, and we finally roll some dice after 15 minutes of debate. Miss. Okay, let's start the 15 minutes of debate again.
Right.
And I'm going, that is not role playing. And so that was when I kind of realized how special this skill was that I had seen in half a dozen people just a few years previously, and saw in very few people as the game became super popular. And at least for me, that started when I also sat down and said, okay, because I now realize this skill is rare, if you can do things like use it in a computer game, if we can translate it, if the people that are better at this can figure out how to do that in a programmatic way, it means we can reach a larger audience even than you could with 6 people at a time around a table.
Right. I think Starr and I are close to the same age. I was born in 71. I think you were born in 70 or 71.
70, yeah.
I think Richard is slightly more mature.
Just slightly.
Than us. But, growing up in that time was a really special time. I've talked about this lots of time on my show, but in that there was a sense of wonder and excitement and accessibility to technology that really never had been before, and since as kind of, computers are now appliances and they're just so commonplace. I worry that a lot of that sense of wonder and discovery is lost. You talked about in your book and in lots of places your discovery of computers with the teletype, and I think you even talked about NASA and getting your mom to get your scout troop in there. Talk a little bit about those early days of computers and what it was about, and I'd like for you to join in too, Starr, about because there was a convergence there in a lot of where you had fantasy games and literature and that were translated to computer games, and you've got Ultima that came out of that, and lots of the early adventure games and things like that. What do you think it was about that convergence of new technology and interactive storytelling, and that seemed to be ripe for these kinds of things to come about?
Yeah, it's interesting if because I went pre-high school, at least for me. There really weren't any personal computers, to be sure, and the only thing that was a true computer that I think I saw before that was down at NASA Mission Control. And down at Mission Control they had you've all seen these big screens that they have up in front of all the controllers, and one of them, and that's real, and it was even real before computers were common. And one of the big screens in the front shows the track of the spacecraft as it's going around the Earth. And I got to go behind that screen one time and see what was creating that track. And there was a computer that was calculating a simple XY position.
Right.
And then that XY position was don't forget, there's no computer display, right? There's no video projector monitor, right? They didn't exist. What was creating this image that was on the screen was a lamp behind a glass table with a map of the Earth basically being projected like a screen on your elementary school
overhead projector.
Right.
Yeah.
But then on the top glass surface, they actually had a stylus with a needle scratching a pane of glass, and so it was literally scratching that path onto a piece of physical glass. And then, when they were used up, they'd get rid of that, put in a piece of glass down. And so they had a permanent record of that track. And so I'm just going like, wow, that is, but at the moment that was magical. I mean, you think about that. I mean, it was still, that's how they did it. It seems archaic now, but it seemed pretty darn high tech at that moment. And so, as soon as, not only were personal computers starting to show up, or even these teletypes before that, right on its heels came some interesting even calculators like the TI-99 for programmable little calculator.
Right.
And people immediately started doing game-like things. And if you look at the things that predate me, there's not much. It's it's Pong, and it's the text game Adventure, and just a couple of others.
Yeah.
But those couple of others were still pretty cool. Even if you think about, if the first thing you ever saw a computer do was Adventure, that would be pretty inspiring.
Yeah.
You'd go like, this thing is actually capable of storytelling.
Yeah.
You're standing on a street and you see a road going to the east to a house with a mailbox, and the road to the west going into a village you can see in the horizon. Which way do you go?
Yeah. I remember playing Zork for the first time, and it absolutely blew my mind. It's 2 lines of text, and but I was there.
But yes, and so the promise of what these could do was apparent instantaneously.
Right.
Now, what wasn't obvious is how quickly it would change. I think I would have been content writing text adventure after text adventure if that was the status quo of the machine at the at the time. But almost instantaneously, the capabilities of the machine began to ramp up, and have continued to ramp up, exponentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I see the point that you're making there about how this sort of new frontier that existed, as Richard was coming up, does not quite exist in the same way.
Right.
But at the same time, and I actually was talking about this yesterday in a panel I gave. I think there's a different kind of age of discovery, or a golden age, where it used to be that the development was a highly sort of specialized endeavor that either required this very, very, very high level of invention, like that you were basically having to machine code at the very, very lowest levels of what the machine was capable of doing. Like, there was no interpreted languages for you to use. There were certainly no engines that you could take off the shelf to render things to a screen. I mean, the screen just had been invented, right? I mean, the screens had just come into existence right before you started making games. So, but now we're kind of in this golden age, which has its upsides and its downsides, where there are engines that you can just use off the shelf, like Unity and Unreal. We have platforms for you to distribute on, like Steam and Apple and Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. We even have funding mechanisms that have disrupted everything, where you don't need a traditional publisher or investors. You can crowdfund, like with Kickstarter, like we've done. And so it means that basically anybody can make games now, kind of like it was at the beginning. So we're kind of back in a age of wonder, where anybody can make games. Now, the downside to that is everyone's making games, and so there are literally there are more games now than there are consumers in some days, right? And so we're in a discovery problem. Ironically, we're in this age of discovery, and now we have a discovery problem. And so I think there is that wonder, and and I look at my daughter who's 7, and even though technology is kind of just appliances everywhere, she still has that sense of wonder about what this magical touch thing does, and and she wants me to show her Shroud of the Avatar all the time. She like I have to actively go like, no, we're not going to play that right now. Let's read a book, or let's play Monument Valley. Daddy, played Shroud of the Avatar all day today. So
This is work.
Yeah.
I don't want to go back. I just want
I want to just throw out one thing too, though. When we were talking about how important this new golden age is with tools. When I worked on the first Ultima that did tile graphics. You know the old stories about I had to walk back and forth to school both ways in the snow uphill.
Right.
Well, let me tell you, when I wanted to put a splot of apparent grass on the screen, you want it to be a basically random distribution of green dots that when you tile it, does not show striping or other patterns.
Right.
And of course, you can't test that unless you just kind of do it. You got to put some up on the screen and see if you see a pattern.
Sure.
But there's no art tool, right? There's no tool to draw this. And so what I actually had to do is I had to first sit down and draw it out on graph paper. And the way the Apple II memory was set up is with 32 bytes.
Right.
Only 7 bits of each 8 bits would show up on screen. So I had to first do a 14 by 16 pixel pattern of dots that I thought would look like grass in some way, shape, or form. Then I had to convert that into binary, including keeping the hidden color bit correct. Then I had to convert that binary into hexadecimal. Then I had to type manually that hexadecimal into the memory of the computer, write a routine to store that out to disk to hold up the tile, then write a program based upon a map set of coordinates that also had to be manually poked into the memory. Repeat these tiles across the screen, and now look at it and go, does it look like grass? And you go like, well, if there's a purple pixel in there, I'm going like, well, where did I screw up? Is it on the graph paper? Is it on the binary? Is it on the hexadecimal? Is it on loading and storing? Is it on the copying to the screen? And if it was wrong, you literally have to manually go back all the way through there just to put a dot on the screen. And so that goes back to this invention he was saying, where there was nothing you didn't have to invent. There was nothing, anything that the machine was going to do, you had to invent it. There was no help from, you turn it on, the machine, the memory's empty, now what?
Yeah, those days were not better. Were you surprised at the success of Ultima?
Well, yeah. Well, in fact, a Calabath, which is sort of Ultima Zero, in my mind. Yeah. I didn't write it intending to be published. I just wrote it because it was fun to do, and and I could show it off to my D&D campaign friends at my house. They were the only people that I assumed would ever see it, and it was the owner of a Computerland store where I had a summer job that said, "Hey, you ought to publish it. Ziploc bag and Ziploc bag, state of the art." And we only sold 5 or 6, or maybe I think 11 to be specific, 11 copies or so on the pegboard. And then I got a call from California Pacific that said, "Hey, we'd like to distribute it nationally," which means put it in a bigger Ziploc bag and double the price. And no one was more surprised than I was when they sent me a royalty check, which was they had sold 30,000 copies and my royalties were $5 a piece. If you do that math, that's $150,000. And so in high school, getting a check for $150,000, when your dad's salary as an astronaut is about $65,000, for something that took you about 7 weeks of after school time, you're going like, wow, that worked out pretty well. Maybe I should go do another one of those. But the cost of making a Calabath was basically zero, and so that was the return on investment was almost infinite. So it's the highest ROI I've ever had, and it's been downhill, ever since.
Sure. How do you follow up something like that? I mean, you're like you said, you're in high school. You're making more than twice that your dad, an astronaut, is making. As things progressed and got better, and then as technology gets better, demand is higher because we need to keep pushing the envelope. How do you follow that up and keep something going for as long as you did?
Well, we actually got started. There was a pattern of activity that started as an accident that later became on purpose when we realized it worked. And the accident was, if you look at a Calabath, there's no story really in it. There's no conclusion really in it. And so, because I never made it for the public, right? And so as soon as it sold that well, I went, wow, I could do much better just by knowing that I'm going to send it to people. Just knowing the fact that someone else will look at it, right. I could clean it up and make a truly better game just by understanding its goal. And so Ultima 1 really is better considerably than a Calabath. And as soon as I did that, I went, wow, I've now been writing in this language called BASIC, not only for these 2 games, but all the teletype games I've done before that.
Sure. And
I'd begun to see the assembly language underlying the BASIC, and I was like, well, if I learn assembly language, I could put a lot more power into this. So Ultima 2 was the very first ever assembly language program I ever wrote. I learned assembly language while writing Ultima 2. And so when I finished it, it's much better than Ultima 1, but also it's pretty clunky assembly code. It's because it was the first code I ever wrote.
Sure.
And so at the end of that, I'm going like, wow, if I just started over again, I could really clean this up a lot. And now that I understand the power of this language, I could, really take on a lot more with the same machine. So it's important to note that the same Apple II, the same 1 megahertz 64K Apple II, is what I wrote Akalabeth, Ultima 1, Ultima 2, and Ultima 3, and even Ultima 4. On that, the hardware was not getting appreciably better during this period of time.
Right.
What was changing is my skill level in approaching it, and this penchant to start over and really try to do the maximum advancement that I could. Now, what's interesting is if you look at my competitors at the time, which were Wizardry, Might and Magic, Bard's Tale, those sort of products, often their first product outsold my first product. But what, for example, Wizardry did, and this was largely true of the others as well, is their publishers said, wow, Wizardry 1 sold great. If we change out the dungeons and change out the monsters and change out the story, we could pretty quickly create a sequel and sell a new game, which they did. But Wizardry 2 was not a technological revolution from Wizardry 1. And so it actually sold to a subset of the people who bought and enjoyed Wizardry 1. And so the sales of the sequels of a lot of my competitors would diminish over time, whereas if you go from Akalabeth, Ultima 1, 2, 3, 4, every one was more than twice the sales of its predecessor, largely because of this innovation process. And so that innovation is what became the plan. But that takes us over to Ultima Online. I mean, if you look at Ultima Online, that brings in an entire new class of ways that people can interact that obviously was proved to be very powerful.
Right. Starr, how did Ultima Online come to be?
So, my joke is always it's because of a rocket to the face. Right about the time Doom came out, so I was in quality assurance at the time, so I was a game tester, and I had been at Origin for about 2 years at the time, and Doom came out, and in QA we would have very short breaks, like for dinner. So we would crunch. We would have to work overtime, and then we'd have like a short dinner break, and then we'd have to go back to testing whatever game we were testing. And I think at the time we were testing maybe Ultima 8. It was probably Ultima 8. I think it was Ultima 8. And so and I was the QA lead for the French translation because I let people know, I speak French. I grew up in Louisiana and my dad spoke French, and so I was like, I speak French, I can lead up that part of the Ultimate testing. So anyway, we were taking a break, and somebody was like, hey, this game came out and you can play multiplayer over a network, and we're like, we have a network, oh cool. So we started doing Doom death matches over our dinner break, and it was this sort of light bulb that went off in my head when I got a rocket I came around a corner and somebody shot a rocket into my face, and I was like, oh my god, like people are way cooler than AI. Like right. the unpredictability and the excitement of interacting with other people in a multiplayer space. And then I all of a sudden had this flashback of like Dungeons and Dragons, and Ultima had this structure of like you and a party of other characters going off on adventure together, just like a Dungeons and Dragons party. And I was like, oh wow, like we should totally just do Ultima, but with a party of other, instead of a party of NPCs operated by AI, let's just have other people be playing over the internet. Or at first it was like, well, let's just do network play. Like that was the original pitch, and it was called Multima. And in the original pitch it was going to be a LAN game like Doom, and it was going to be more like a D&D style, like a party-based thing, where you would literally play Ultima. Everyone would pick one of the characters, like, I'm going to be Dupre, I'm going to be the Avatar, I'm going to be, YOLO. And then doing more research, it was like, oh, there's these other games where people play over the internet. You know, they like MUDs and MOOs where like people can be all over the world and not just connected by a local a LAN, a local network. It's like, oh wow, that's way cooler. We should, and then and so it grew from just being a sort of simple multiplayer to what we, and then we were like, well, that's bigger than just multiplayer. What can we call that? Because there wasn't really a name for it, even though there were pre-existing games like Neverwinter Nights, and even before that there was a game called Habitat. Those were kind of the first graphical MMOs, even though they weren't called that yet. And that's where we came up with like, well, what's bigger than multiplayer? And they were like, massively multiplayer. And so that's where we came, and then that's when we came up with that term. And I was still in QA at the time, though. And so, but I kept pitch. I was like, well, I shouldn't be in QA. I should be a developer, and I should make this game. And so me and this guy Ken Demarest, who had done a game called Bioforge, he and I pitched this idea to Richard. And actually, the idea of doing a multiplayer Ultima had actually been around prior to that and sort of been bandied about, but it had always been like, well, the world, you know, the tech isn't ready for it yet. And so when we pitched it to Richard, and Richard was like, oh, this is great, we should totally do this, but then there was no budget for it. And so we had to go to our parent company, because we had just been acquired by Electronic Arts, and we had to go to the parent company and ask for money. And we got denied multiple times. And so you tell the story of like how we got the money for it. So
yeah, it's EA has a formal pitch process to greenlight any project, as do many big publishers, by the way. So this isn't just unique to EA. And to get a project started, you had to put together a design document. There would then be, you'd hand that design document over to sales. Sales would look for comparables out there in the world to make sales projections based upon whether they believed it was better or worse than the other comparables that existed. And then based upon what your budget said you needed to spend, or you were asking for, and what sales thought you could generate, if that return on investment was good enough, then they greenlit your project. Well, in our case, there was no MMO previously. And so the largest selling, you know, these things were on dial-up BBSs, you know, had maybe 5,000, 10,000 people playing at best.
So yeah, Air Warrior was the biggest so far, and they had 30,000 lifetime.
And so EA said, well, we'll assume you're going to be the best-selling game that exists, so 30,000 units. So they you know, and already, by the way, in this day and age, other games were selling millions. And so when the forecast comes back and they think it's 30,000 lifetime, that means there's really no profit in it. And so EA turned us down. And so we went back and watched. This was right as the World Wide Web was really getting started. And 6 months goes by. We see this growth of the internet. We come back 6 months later to pitch the same game. 6 months later, they tell us no again. We come back yet a third time. Now it's a full year after the initial pitch. We pitch the same game a third time. We're told no a third time. And then at that point, we basically said, we're not leaving the room until you say yes. We literally did the childish stomp our feet, hold our breath. We believe in this so much that we're not going to take no for an answer. And while we don't expect you to fund the multiple millions of dollars of the full development, you know, the budget for Origin was already $10 or $20 million a year. You know, we said we want $250,000 to be able to prove to you that this will work and that it will be compelling. And even though they never really, you know, they never agreed, but to get rid of us, they finally signed this piece of paper that I had brought with me to, here's your $250,000, get out of our face. And that started UO as sort of this bastard stepchild of a project that got, not only almost no funding, but the resource opportunities we had, for personnel and machines was always, always got if anybody else needed that hardware or that person, they stole them away from us. So we had this kind of ragtag band that literally, like when offices were being remodeled, the other projects got the finished offices, and the UO team had to sit in the hallway with plastic covering the hallways to keep the dust out of their computers. No joke, literally that.
Yeah, and because the internet wasn't going to be a big deal. Like no one's going to play games on the internet. Like it's that. I mean, that was literally the attitude. Like, but I mean, you got to have perspective of the time, because at that point, companies didn't even have public-facing websites.
Right.
Like, we had the first public-facing website in all of Electronic Arts. For Ultima Online's website was the first time that the entire company had a website that the public could access.
That is insane.
And it had llamas on it.
And then what happened with it? Well, so that first website was a call to action for players. It basically said, we've got this demo ready. We've spent our $250,000. We would like for you to come playtest this for us so we can demonstrate it. But we need you to pay us $5 for the privilege of being a beta tester because this internet wasn't fast enough to download the client. We had to send you a CD.
And we had forgotten to budget money to mail those. Because we didn't realize, we forgot about that. We were like, oh, wait, the internet's not big. The download speeds aren't big enough. Because a 14.4 modem, everyone had 14.4 modems. And we're like, the client's too big to download. Oops. Like the pre-alpha, because the pre-alpha was small enough, because the size of the land in the pre-alpha was small enough that everyone could download it and play it. But once we got to the alpha and the beta test, it got too big, and we were like, oh, we don't have any money left.
And within hours, 50,000 people
had signed up for the beta. And that's when EA was like, oh,
for a paid beta.
For a paid beta. And this was in '96, right? And that's when EA woke up and was like, oh, now this is the most important thing of all in all of EA. Right. And then it's like, oh, well then we're going to buy a booth at E3. And this was actually the E3 in Atlanta. The 1 year it was here in Atlanta, ironically. And we're going to send you a bunch of executives to come help run the project.
We're going to come help.
Yeah. Some of them were actually very helpful.
And many of them weren't.
Yeah, many weren't. But some were very helpful.
So that went on to be immense. And
well, it was the fastest selling PC game in Origin and EA history at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And you guys pioneered an entire genre. The MMORPG was born there, and which brings us to the reason that we're here talking today. You guys have a new project, Shroud of the Avatar, that you kickstarted, that takes a lot of these concepts but brings it into the the modern internet age. Tell me about the idea for this. You guys worked with Tracy Hickman on this also, who everybody that listens to the show knows and loves Tracy. How did this get started, and why is now the time to do this?
Well, what's interesting is Ultima Online, and I would argue, still is an extremely unique product. In even after 15 years of MMOs now being created, because I think everybody chased a different development model, a different product style. That if you look at our early competitors, it would be games like EverQuest, which was obviously a great game and sold quite well. That was eventually overtaken by World of Warcraft, which is obviously a phenomenal game and has done phenomenally well. But if you look at almost all MMO offerings, they've sort of been they've been chasing that vein. And the way I would describe that, and what's different about that than what we already did with Ultima and what we are fundamentally doing differently with Shroud of the Avatar also, is that in those games, every player is first and foremost a combatant. In fact, the way they gate content is based upon your level. When you are level 1, you get a small area of land that you're sort of fenced in by level 2 monsters, and by grinding at level 1, you become level 2, and now a new part of the game is exposed to you. And by the way, that's a great game mechanic. I'm not knocking that as a very motivating and rewarding game mechanic.
Sure.
But it means that even if you are a crafter of some kind, or a magician, or a role player, just to travel the world, you must also be a grinding warrior.
Right.
And with Ultima Online, that was not the case. With Ultima Online, sure, more than half the people probably are warriors in one form or another out there, fighting to level up. But the whole world can be explored from day one, and there are hard areas to go into and easy areas to go into. And we built out roles of role playing that were very deep and expansive, that had nothing to do with combat. And so, one of my favorite aspects of that really kind of even showed up in Ultima Online was the fact that, if you were a blacksmith, you could have an entire life as a blacksmith, a very rewarding career, in fact, financially, literally in US dollars, rewarding career as a blacksmith. But what that would mean is, you would be providing you would be selling your wares to these adventurers, these fighters, but you would also need resources. You'd need ore and coal and all these things that the miners would have to go get out of the dungeons. And the miners to go to the dungeons needed protection from the warriors. And so miners would hire warriors who would buy from the blacksmiths who would buy from the miners. And thus this interdependence was created with these very diverse roles, and you now suddenly have a virtual economy that is working in a way and supporting these very diverse ways to play the game that I think since Ultima Online have never really been close to fulfilled. And so with Shroud of the Avatar, we sort of had a few key high points that we wanted to re-illustrate. So that we believe that in the last decade, there's really no one that has chased our model of gameplay, our model of game design. And so if we could, if we are ultimately successful with Shroud of the Avatar, in my mind, I hope that it's because we've included a deep, socially relevant, personally relevant story akin to the virtue stories in the starting with Ultima 4.
Right.
That we create a detailed sandbox world simulation that I think we did really well in Ultima 7 and Ultima Online, and that we create a pantheon of interdependent role-playing roles to play, like we did with Ultima Online. And then if you wrap that together in a modern user interface for an MMO that avoids some of the lead you by the nose trappings that a lot of them have with exclamation points and arrows on the map, and cause you to think a little bit more about your role and responsibility with your agency within the game, then I think we've been successful.
Yeah, and then the story that you and Tracy wrote, since the podcast is about storytelling, you want to talk a little bit about how you and Tracy decided to do that together?
Yeah, well, I actually met Tracy here at DragonCon 1. We were both guests.
Really?
Wow. I was the computer gaming guest of honor at DragonCon 1, and he was the writer guest of honor at DragonCon 1.
Nice.
And I got to tell you, when I first sat in a room, and he was doing his killer breakfast, I think, was the first thing I ever saw that Tracy was doing. But I listened to him do live storytelling, and I fancy myself a reasonably good game master live storyteller. But he was in a whole nother league. He was so much better than anyone I'd ever seen before. And then I began to look at his written work as well, and I'm going like, this, if there is a master storyteller, here is one standing right before me.
Right.
And so I became a big admirer of Tracy's, over the decades that we've been coming here to DragonCon and other cons. And we've always been looking for an opportunity to work together. And interestingly, the first chance we had to work together was not on games. It was actually my trip to space, where he had shown me a game pitch that he had done about this party game for shooting a movie in one take in order at a dinner party, and then debuting it at your dinner party. And I was going, I need to do that with my crewmates in space. So I had him write me a movie that I could shoot with my crewmates in space, which I did. And it turned out great. You should go check it out. It's called Apogee of Fear. It's available on YouTube. And but that little taste of working with Tracy was so fun, and we had such a good time doing it. I was going like, okay, this is the time. We're starting a new game. We're starting a new company. We've got to do it. And Tracy felt the same way. He's been wanting to get involved with what we were doing from the beginning too. So we we collaborated together first on writing the backstory, the Blade of the Avatar, and we
Sword of Midras now.
And
it's called Sword of Midras.
Oh,
now.
sorry, yes. Yeah, the Blade of the Avatar was its original working title. And then we sat down together and worked out the foundational story for Shroud of the Avatar, and the great part about working with Tracy is just how instantaneously prolific he is with incredible high quality, and how malleable he is to work within a whole new world. So we could give him the constraints of our truth and love and courage are the themes of this game, and he would just be this fountain of masterful creativity that we could then help guide to the gaming, the interaction needs that we needed as a game. It was a real joy.
And what's interesting too is because he wrote this prequel novel, The Sword of Midras. If you read it, the prequel novel is written how many, like 200 years earlier? Is that right, or 300?
200.
So it's written 200 years before the game takes place, and so it's kind of ancient history. And so a lot of the cities, and there's a big war that happens, so a lot of the cities get destroyed and things like that. And so what's great is when you're playing the game, you can sort of like take this grand tour through the game of all the locations that you read about in the book, and you can see all these like points of interest, and like, oh, like I was in this town, like when I was reading the book, I was in this town, and I remember there was that fortress that was destroyed, and like you can walk through the ruins, and you can be like, oh, this is the thing I read about in the, and so it's a great sort of background. You don't have to read the book, but it's a great background for playing the game, and like Richard said, he was a great pleasure to work with, and that's one of the things that's slightly different for Shroud than, say, Ultima Online. You know, Shroud is kind of a mashup and homage to both Ultima Online and the single-player Ultimas, because it's got this really deep sandbox, you know, live a virtual medieval life. But on top of that is this, you know, story that you can follow that Richard and Tracy co-wrote, you know, that's more akin to the single-player Ultimas. That coexists with each other, and that you can play that both as a single player, because the game supports multiple modes of play. You can play it as a single player game, and you can play it as a multiplayer game.
And that's really unique now. To have that ability. So you guys are innovating once again.
Yeah, that's the only other game that's really ever had both a ability to play offline and online was like Diablo 1.
Right.
You know, and so we're kind of going back and reinventing a tech that people don't use nowadays. And it really, what's funny is it was born out of I tease Richard as a selfish request of Richard's of like, I want to play when I'm on an airplane, since Richard has to like travel all the time. But it also was more about, you know, how giving players the tools to play how they want to play. You know,
right.
I give them, let them choose. Like, I want to play offline single player, like an old school Ultima, and just follow the story. Or I want to play like Ultima Online. I want to play a big open sandbox MMO, or I want to play somewhere in the middle where I'm just playing with my friends, or I still want to log on the servers, and I want to play by myself, but I want to log on the servers so I see what other people are doing, and just let you sort of dial it to how you want.
We are running out of time. I know you guys have things to do, but speak very quickly, if you will, about kickstarting, and you talked about what the chore it was to get Ultima Online funded first off, and then up. But you guys have taken the crowdfunding approach. What does that open up for you, and what does that mean for the future of gaming, do you think?
So crowdfunding is, you know, as I was mentioning earlier, it's part of this kind of golden age of like democratization of development, where you don't have to go to the traditional places like publishers or investors. And what you do is you get to go directly to the consumer. You get to say, hey, here's a product that you might like. And you get to basically ask them, is this something you want? And hopefully they want it. In our case, they did. And so, but it's a risk, right? You know, you're taking a big risk by saying, hey, is this something that the customer wants? Because if they don't want it, then you know very early in the process that you're not going to have a product that's viable in the marketplace. But crowdfunding is an amazing opportunity, and there's basically two ways you can go about crowdfunding. You can go the route we took, which is what we call very open development, where we're super, super transparent about everything we do. We do monthly releases the last Thursday of the month at 10:30 a.m. We've done 44 of those in a row. We're never late, always on time, 10:30. Knock on wood. Like we post our stand-up notes to our forums every day, so every day our backers know what every single person on our team is working on, or a more traditional sort of closed model where you take the money up front and you're kind of like, we'll see you guys when we're done.
Right.
Both of them are very viable, I think I'm a big fan of crowdfunding, but I also give advice to people who are thinking about doing that you know, it's definitely got some pros and cons. If you choose to go as kind of the open development model that we went, the things you have to understand is, one, you have to have a very strong vision of what you want to do, because you're going to get a lot of feedback.
Right.
A lot of feedback, and it's going to be very strongly worded sometimes. I mean, luckily we in our case we have Richard, who has a very strong vision of what he wants, and if you look at what we pitched at the beginning, I mean, we've literally delivered exactly what we said we were going to deliver. I mean, it's the mashup of an MMO and an Ultima, and that's what we're doing. But if we didn't have a Richard who has a very strong vision, then it would have been much harder to stay on target, and I always have a picture, when I present this slide, I always have a picture of Porkins from Star Wars, stay on target. So that's, and you're also going to get a lot, consumers aren't used to interacting with product that's still in development.
Right.
And so, I always talk about, imagine putting someone on the highway with a car with no steering wheel, and then they're immediately going to complain that they can't steer the car. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I told you I was going to put you in a car with no steering wheel. Don't tell me that you can't steer the car.
Right.
But that's exactly the first thing they're going to tell you.
Sure.
And so, but eyes wide open, if you're aware of all those things, crowdfunding is this amazing opportunity to sort of sidestep the traditional models, and it gives you a ton of freedom.
And I would even say, just one thing I'd add to that is, large companies by necessity are somewhat risk averse. Mm-hmm. If you're going to compete in the billion-dollar class, game sales, picking a new property or a new game design is most likely not going to achieve that level of sales.
Right.
And so if a big publisher has the choice of, let me sequel the last one that I had that came close to that, or make a bet on something I've never seen before, of course they're going to be stuck in their sequelitis and be and not that interested in the first Ultima Online that shows up on their door. And so if you're going to do something like that, it's an advantage to have a mechanism like crowdfunding that lets you sidestep that. So I think a lot of the true innovation in the gaming industry is going to come from things like crowdfunding, and that once you've found a model that works, then the big companies will buy it up and try to sequel it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday.